Good day and welcome back to Scriptures Unlocked. We will now continue on part 2 of Genesis 41, where we will look at Joseph's rise to power. So in the previous presentation, we looked at where Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream after he was released from prison. So this presentation will now focus on his rise to power in Egypt. So this presentation is entitled Joseph's Rise to Power in Egypt. In the previous presentation, Joseph interpreted Pharaoh's dream when none of his magicians or wise men could. And he also provided a solution to the problem by advising the king of Egypt on what to do. So we'll pick up the story by giving a recap on the advice that Joseph gave to Pharaoh. And this takes us to Genesis 41 verse 33 onwards. Now therefore, let Pharaoh look out a man discreet and wise, and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land, and take the 5th part of the land of Egypt in the 7 plenteous years, and let them gather all the food of those good years that come, and lay up corn under the hand of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. So the idea was to keep the food that would be produced during the 7 years of plenty in the cities from which they came. And that food shall be for store to the land against the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land perish not through the famine. And the thing was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and in the eyes of all his servants. So Joseph's advice paved the way for his elevation to become the second in command over all Egypt, when Pharaoh promoted him to be governor or prime minister, meaning Joseph became the chief minister, second only to Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Notice what Pharaoh then said and did following Joseph's advice. Genesis 41 verse 38 onwards tells us this. And Pharaoh said unto his servants, can we find such a one as this, a man in whom the Spirit of God is? And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, for as much as God hath showed thee all this, there is none so discreet and wise as thou art. Thou shalt be over my house, and according unto thy word shall all my people be ruled. Only in the throne will I be greater than thou. Viewers, here again we can see Joseph being a type of Christ, because just as how Joseph became the second most powerful man in Egypt, Jesus Christ is the second most powerful person in all the universe as the Son of God. Jesus Christ is only second to God the Father in all the universe. And Joseph typified Christ in this respect when he became the second most powerful man in all of Egypt. So here you can see Pharaoh promoting Joseph from being a slave to the second most powerful position in Egypt. He became the prime minister, the chief minister over Pharaoh's affairs. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, see, I have set thee over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh took off his ring from his hand and put it upon Joseph's hand, and arrayed him in vestures of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him to ride in the second chariot which he had. And they cried before him, bow the knee. And he made him ruler over all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh said unto Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without thee shall no man lift up his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. So again, viewers, through divine providence, Joseph was released from prison and given great authority over Egypt. Joseph's life story while in Egypt can rightly be described as from rags to riches, as where he was shackled in the prison house, he was now clothed in vestments of fine linen. And here you can see on screen Pharaoh putting his gold ring on Joseph's finger and putting a gold chain around his neck. And here Joseph was given Pharaoh's second chariot to move about all Egypt. So Joseph was elevated from being a slave in Potiphar's house to the second most powerful position in the most powerful country in the then known world. Notice Genesis 41 verse 45. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath Pahaneah, and he gave him to wife Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, and Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So here, Pharaoh made Joseph a naturalized Egyptian. He changed his name. He gave him a new name, an Egyptian name, Zaphnath Pahaneah, which means treasury of the glorious rest. And here, he also gave him an Egyptian wife. Joseph was married into a very influential family in Egypt. His wife, Asenath, her name means belonging to the goddess Neth, and her name appears 3 times in all of Scripture. And her father's name, Potiphar, means he whom the Ra gave. So viewers, Pharaoh made Joseph a naturalized Egyptian when he gave him an Egyptian name as well as an Egyptian wife, which was to remove the stigma of him being a Hebrew. And only persons in Pharaoh's inner circle actually knew that Joseph was not an Egyptian, because he knew the language and looked very much like an Egyptian with his shaved head. How do I know this? Because in Genesis 41 verse 14, we are told this. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him hastily out of the dungeon. And he shaved himself and changed his raiment and came in unto Pharaoh. The Hebrew word translated as shave is galak. It occurs 23 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 1548. It has been translated as shave 17 times, shave off 4 times, and poll twice. It means to poll, to shave off, or to be bald. And poll means to shave the hair from your head. So Joseph, when he came out of prison, shaved not just his beard, but he shaved all the hair from his head. So galak is a primitive root, properly to be bald. That is, to shave. So viewers, many ancient Egyptians shaved their heads for hygiene purposes, to avoid being afflicted with lice and bugs, as well as to cope with the hot climate in Egypt, because as I mentioned in the previous presentation, most of Egypt, 92 to 96% of Egypt is desert, so it was a hot and arid climate. Additionally, Egyptian priests were required to frequently shave all the hair on their bodies, because being clean-shaven was seen as a symbol of cleanliness and religious purity. Wealthy Egyptians often shaved their heads and usually wore elaborate headdresses or wigs to demonstrate their high social standing. Therefore, Joseph, as the scripture states, shaved himself as soon as he was released from prison and stood before Pharaoh in Genesis 41 verse 14. And notice Genesis 41 verse 46. And Joseph was 30 years old when he stood before Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So based on the scriptures, we now know that Joseph was 30 years old when he became prime minister of Egypt. Therefore, with this information, we can also ascertain the exact year that he was promoted based on all the information provided so far from the scriptures. Remember, we are tracing the nation of Israel from the call of Abraham. So Abraham was born 2,080 years after creation. Isaac was born when Abraham was 100 years, which meant Isaac was born 2,108 years after Adam was created. And we know from scripture that Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born. Since Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born, then it's absolutely clear that Joseph was born 2,259 years after creation. By doing a simple calculation, Isaac was born in the year 2108 since creation. Isaac was 60 years old when Jacob was born, and Jacob was 91 years old when Joseph was born. So when Joseph was born, it was 2,259 years after creation. Therefore, Joseph was sold into Egypt as a slave 2,276 years after creation, when he was 17 years old. and he became the second most powerful man in Egypt 13 years later when he was 30 years old, and exactly 2,289 years after creation. So he was born 2,259 years after creation, and 30 years later, in 2,289 years after creation, he became the prime minister or the governor of Egypt. And notice what we are then told. After his elevation and promotion by Pharaoh, Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. And in the 7 plenteous years, the earth brought forth by handfuls. And here you can see Joseph going throughout the land of Egypt and surveying and ensuring that the barns were built so that the grains and the corn could be stored throughout the 7 years of plenty. And here you can see the Egyptians working assiduously to store the grains from the field and to take them to the storehouses in the cities. And here on screen you are seeing them filling the storehouses with the grain and the corn during the 7 years of plenty. Genesis 41 verse 48 to 52 tells us this. And he, Joseph, gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt, and laid up the food in the cities. The food of the field, which was round about every city, laid he up in the same. And Joseph gathered corn as the sand of the sea, very much, until he left numbering, for it was without number. So Joseph, as a good steward, kept a record of all crops that were produced throughout the 7 years of plenty. It was so much during the 7 years of abundance that Joseph left off numbering the amount of farm produce that they gathered. And then we are told, and unto Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of famine came. So we know that the years of famine started 7 years after Joseph reached the age of 30. So we know for certain that his 2 sons were born before he was 37 years old, because his sons were born before the years of famine came. And the years of plenty lasted for 7 years, and then the years of famine would follow for another 7 years. And Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for God, said he, hath made me forget all my toil and all my father's house. And the name of the second called he Ephraim, for God had caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. So Joseph named his 2 sons, Manasseh, the firstborn, and Ephraim, his secondborn. Here on screen, you are seeing the Hebrew script of his first son's name. It is pronounced Menashe. And on screen, you are seeing, here is his wife Asenath, here is Manasseh, and here is the birth of Ephraim. Manasseh occurs 146 times in the Hebrew scriptures. It is Strong's H 4519. Manasseh means causing to forget. He was the eldest son of Joseph and progenitor of the tribe of Manasseh. Ephraim was Joseph's second son. His name occurs 180 times throughout scripture. It is Strong's H 669. It has been translated as Ephraim 176 times and Ephraimite 4 times. Ephraim means double ash heap, or I shall be doubly fruitful. So viewers, in naming his 2 sons, Joseph did not forget his heritage, because he gave his children Hebrew names, even though he was a naturalized Egyptian, but he didn't forget that he was a Hebrew. Genesis 41 verse 53 tells us this. And the 7 years of plenteousness that was in the land of Egypt were ended. So we know that at this point in time, Joseph was now 37 years old. And the 7 years of dearth or famine began to come, according as Joseph had said. And the dearth was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. And when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. And Pharaoh said unto all the Egyptians, Go unto Joseph, what he said to you, do. And the famine was over all the face of the earth. And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold unto the Egyptians, and the famine waxed sore in the land of Egypt. And all countries came into Egypt to Joseph for to buy corn, because that the famine was so sore in all lands. So all the surrounding nations were experiencing great distress and great famine. But Egypt was the only place in the then known world that had food. So Joseph's astute management of the impending crisis resulted in Egypt being the only country that had food available throughout the 7 years of famine. And this would now set the stage for Joseph's brothers to come to Egypt in order to survive. And here you can see, during the 7 years of famine, people came to Egypt and the Egyptians came to Joseph, and Joseph sold them corn so that they could be fed throughout the 7 years of famine. So viewers, this brings us to the end of this presentation on Joseph's rise to power in Egypt. In the next presentation, we will then look at Joseph's brothers coming to Egypt to get corn so that they could be sustained in the land of Canaan. Because remember, the scripture tells us that the famine waxed sore in all the lands. So everywhere around Egypt was experiencing severe drought and severe famine. And Egypt was the only place that food was available. Jacob would then send his sons to Egypt to get bread so that they could survive the severe famine that was taking over the then known world at the time. So thank you for listening, thank you for watching, and may God continue to bless us as we continue to study His words. Have yourselves a great day.